Welcome back to another episode of Disturbing Truth, where we share disturbing true stories from around the world. Today's video is about the two worst serial killers from my hometown in Australia. Perth is the capital of Western Australia. It's known as quite an isolated city, as most of the major cities in Australia are located on the east and south coast. The case of the Claremont serial killer all started with the disappearance of Sarah Spears. She was just 18 years old at the time, on the 27th of January 1996. She left Club A View, a nightclub in the well-to-do suburb of Claremont, around 2 a.m. At 2:06 a.m, Sarah called Swan Taxis from a public telephone. She was then sighted waiting alone near the corner of Stirling Road and Stirling Highway by 3 eyewitnesses, who also mentioned seeing an unidentified car stopping where she was waiting. However, she was not at the location when the taxi she called arrived at 2:09 a.m, and her disappearance soon attracted massive public attention. In the early hours of Sunday the 9th of June 1996, just 4 months after Sarah disappeared, Jane Rimmer, 23 years old, also disappeared from the same part of Claremont. Similar to Sarah, she had been out socialising with her friends. Jane's friends explained how they had moved from the Ocean Beach Hotel to the Continental Hotel and then Club A View. Noting the long line at the club, her friends then called a taxi home, but Rimmer opted to stay. She was last seen on security footage waiting outside the Continental at 12:04 a.m. 55 days after her disappearance, on Saturday the 3rd of August 1996, her naked body was found 40 kilometres south in bushland in the suburb of Wellard by a family picking wildflowers. The following year, in the early hours of Saturday the 15th of March 1997, Kira Glennon, a 27-year-old lawyer, also disappeared from the Claremont area. Eerily similar to the others, she was with friends at the Continental and had decided to make her own way home. 3 men at a bus stop saw Kira walking south along Stirling Highway at approximately 12:30 a.m. and observed her interacting with an unidentified light-coloured vehicle, which had stopped by her. 19 days later, on the 3rd of April, her semi-clothed body was found by a bushwalker 40 kilometres north near a track in scrub off Pipperdinny Road in Eglinton. Within 48 hours of the disappearance of Sarah, the case was taken over by the Major Crime Squad. After the disappearance of Jane, the Western Australia Police set up a special task force called Macro to investigate the two similar cases. After the final disappearance of Kira, police confirmed that they were searching for a serial killer, and the Western Australian government offered a $250,000 award, the largest ever offered in the state at the time. Initial suspicion centred on the unidentified vehicles seen at 2 of the locations, and on an unidentified man seen in some blurry CCTV footage. Suspicion then focused on Perth's taxi drivers, because the women were last seen in circumstances where they would have needed to use taxis. A massive fingerprint and DNA testing operation was carried out on the thousands of taxi drivers licensed in Western Australia. To be honest, the years the crimes were unsolved, I personally believed it would have been a taxi driver, since all the victims disappeared from night spots near taxi ranks. In April 1998, a public servant named Lance Williams, 41 years old, who still lived with his parents, was identified by police as a main suspect after his odd behaviour attracted their attention. He was known to be socially awkward and was frequently driving around after midnight and circling the Claremont area. He was arrested, interviewed in depth, police raided his parents' house and dug up their backyard, kept him under constant surveillance at home and even at work. When the media got a hold of this information, then the attention on him got even worse, as now they had reporters harassing his elderly parents. After interviewing him a total of 6 times at length, in which Lance always declared his innocence, and with no evidence of his guilt, police declared in late 2008 that he was no longer a person of interest. In 2018, at the age of 61, Lance died of cancer. I remember discussing with my father about Lance, and he always said how terrible it must have been for his life to be ruined in that way. After 20 years with so much investigative work carried out, with hundreds of police officers and millions of dollars spent, so little progress had seemed to be achieved. But a few days before Christmas in 2016, Macro detectives had raided a home in the Perth suburb of Kewdale and had taken a 48-year-old man into custody in connection with the Claremont serial killer case. The following morning, police held a press conference to announce the man. Telstra technician Bradley Robert Edwards had been charged with the murder of Jane and Kira. Using his work vehicle, a Telstra-issued Holden Commodore station wagon, Bradley drove both women to separate but equally remote areas of the city's outskirts, where he stabbed them repeatedly in the neck and upper body before partially covering their bodies with branches taken from nearby trees. But before Bradley committed the Claremont killings, On the night of February 4th, 1988, an 18-year-old woman had been attacked in her bed. She awoke to find a man on top of her, his hand over her mouth. Scared, she dug her fingernails into the man's cheek and he got off. When she turned, he was standing in her bedroom doorway, wearing what looked like a woman's nightie. She screamed for her father and the man fled, leaving behind a silky white kimono. In 2016, as part of a review of outstanding cold cases, the kimono from 1988 attack was retested. On it, scientists found sperm stains that also matched the still unknown male's DNA. Detectives didn't know their suspect's name, but they knew from the kimono that he had been prowling the area stealing women's clothes, and they had a fingerprint taken from the doorknob of one of those properties. When it was analysed, investigators were stunned to find it matched Bradley Edwards. His fingerprints were on file because he'd been convicted of assaulting a social worker in a hospital in 1990 while there to repair telephone lines, in which he grabbed the woman from behind without warning, stuffed a cloth into her mouth to stop her calling out, and dragged her backwards across the office before she kicked him and broke free. Cable ties were later found in Edwards' pocket. Police began tracking Bradley and collected DNA from a Sprite bottle he discarded while at the movies with his stepdaughter. It was a perfect match. Around the time of the first attack, Bradley was married, but every day after work he used to just go and sit on his computer all night, which made his wife lonely, and she wanted more from life. Then a housemate moved in, and Bradley's then wife ended up having an affair with him. Bradley couldn't handle it and had a brain snap when he found out about the affair. WA Supreme Court Justice Stephen Hall sentenced Bradley Edwards to a minimum of 40 years behind bars for the murders of Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon. Sarah Spears' body was never found, so there was no evidence linking him to the crime. "I recognise that there is a high likelihood that you will die in prison," Justice Hall said as he delivered the verdict. "You were a dangerous predator who sought out vulnerable young women and attacked them for your own gratification. You targeted unsuspecting women who were usually completely unknown to you. Your actions were premeditated, executed with pitiless determination, and you were remorseless in your disregard for the pain and suffering that you caused." It's the longest non-parole period ever handed out by a WA court. The sentencing of Edwards marks the end of a 7-month criminal trial, thought to be the state's longest and most expensive ever. Outside court, Police Commissioner Chris Dawson said it was a momentous day in which an evil man had been jailed. Edwards is a killer who preyed on innocent women. He devastated families and tormented the West Australian community. The jailing of Edwards means the community is now safe from this terrible person. It is my sincere hope that Edwards will never be released from prison. A few weeks ago, I did a tour of a local decommissioned prison called Fremantle Prison. It has a long history and it was in operation for over 100 years. Anyway, when we were in the room with the gallows, where the hangings were carried out, they spoke about the last man hanged there, Eric Edgar Cooke. Eric was born on the 25th of February 1931 in Perth, Western Australia. He was one of 3 siblings and was subject to frequent physical abuse from his alcoholic father. The sad part was, sometimes his beatings would result from him trying to defend his mother. He had an unfortunate childhood, not just because of his dysfunctional home life, but also because he had a birth defect on his face, a cleft lip and palate. It made him the target of bullying at school and gave him low self-esteem. To avoid the regular abuse from his father, he would roam the streets at night, and when he returned home, he would hide underneath the house. He started getting involved in petty crime and vandalism around his local neighbourhood. He ended up serving an 18-month sentence for arson after setting fire to his local church. He was released and started burglarising homes and also causing unnecessary damage where possible. A few years went by and he seemed to settle down a bit when he married Sarah Lavin, a 19-year-old waitress. The couple went on to have 7 children, but unknowingly to his wife, he kept up a life of petty crime. But his crimes escalated on Australia Day, January 26, 1963. A bunch of different shootings occurred in the middle of the night. The first one was when he approached 2 adults who were having an affair, Rowena Reeves and Nicholas August, as they were sitting in a car. He shot at them, which left injuries to their head and hand. Eric then raised the rifle again and shot, but luckily missed. Nicholas then sped off. They had survived, but there was one thing she would never forget about the shooter. It has haunted her for decades. He had a cruel mouth, she said. He had a bad mouth, a rotten mouth. Eric then walked to a nearby street, climbed up on a garage roof, doubled as a balcony, and shot 29-year-old accountant Brian Weir in the head through a set of open doors. He barely survived the attack and was in a coma for 6 months. Eric then went knocking on random doors, and whoever answered the door, he shot at point-blank range. 18-year-old student John Sturkley and retired grocer George Walmsley, 55 years at the time, was his final victims that night. Both died of gunshot wounds to the head. Despite there being a massive manhunt for the killer, he wasn't yet identified, and Eric's vicious crime spree continued. On another night, he broke into the apartment of 20-year-old Carmel Reed. Eric Cook broke in through an open window. He was in her bedroom, shining a torch in her eyes. When she woke up, he grabbed an umbrella and stabbed her with it. Then Carmel kicked at him and screamed. The wound on her chest was deep enough to bleed, but not kill. She jumped out of bed as Cook backed off. She ran at him and was trying to get the lights on. He stopped at the doorway and punched her in the face. After that, he quickly fled. Since all the crimes were different in nature, Eric was hard to track. All the victims were of different ages and gender, different weapons were used, multiple guns, sometimes stabbing with knives or scissors, and also at different locations each and every time. Police urged the public to be vigilant and lock their doors at night. One night, he killed his innocent victims after they woke up while he was burglarising their homes. On another occasion, he broke into a property and shot at a couple as they slept, leaving their home and belongings intact. Police were ramping up the search for the killer as the crimes continued, and thousands of men were fingerprinted. Then in 1963, in the suburb of Mount Pleasant, a suspicious rifle was found hidden in a bush. Subsequent ballistic tests proved without a doubt that the gun had been used in the murder of Shirley McLeod. Police were now ready to trap the killer by returning to the location and tying a similar looking but inoperable rifle to the bush with an almost invisible fishing line. 17 days later, Eric Edgar Cooke leisurely walked over to the bush to collect his concealed gun. The police had finally caught the man who'd put fear into Perth over the last few years. He eventually confessed to 8 murders, 14 attempted murders, and over 250 burglaries, giving extraordinary details on each and every crime committed. Eric's confessions of murder included those of Gillian Brewer and Rosemary Anderson. However, Daryl Beamish and John Button had already been convicted of those crimes and were sitting in jail. Eric Cook pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity, with his attorneys claiming that he had schizophrenia, with no clear motive for his crimes. All that he could offer up as an explanation for his actions was that he wanted to hurt people. Eric was proved sane and was convicted of willful murder on November 28, 1963. After a 3-day trial, he was sentenced to death by hanging. Despite having grounds to appeal his conviction, he ordered his lawyers not to move forward with it, telling them that he'd killed and deserved to pay for the crimes he'd committed. Still, Eric had one last thing he needed to clear up before he was put to death. Only minutes before he was executed, he saw on the Bible that he'd been the real killer of Gillian Brewer and Rosemary Anderson. While these claims were brushed off as lies at the time, years later, both Daryl Beamish and John Button would have their convictions overturned. Eric Edgar Cooke was hanged on October 26, 1964 at Fremantle Prison. He was 33 years old at the time. Eric was the last person in Western Australia to be hanged. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, hit the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next video.